Oh, okay, thanks. All right, looks like we're ready to go, Jennifer. All right. That's all right. We can adjust.
Yes.
Ready to go. Okay, here we go. Well, good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, April 13th, 2023, and this is the meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority on this date. And we are conducting our city council meetings and our HRA meetings in a hybrid fashion. And today we only have one opportunity for people that might be listening online to call in, and that is during community comment. And remember, whether you're in the audience or you're listening in virtually, with respect to community comment, you can express a concern to the commissioners, the HRA, with regard to any matter that's of concern to you that's not on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing. The call-in number is on the screen. Enter the conference PIN number and the star key, and then press #1 to speak to an operator, and they'll bring you to Director Benarod, who will bring you into the HRA. And we'll go in sequence in terms of first come, first served, and we'll get to folks in that manner. With taking first anybody in the audience that wishes to comment on something that's not on the agenda or scheduled for a future public hearing this morning. So having provided that information, I'm going to call the meeting to order and ask our administrative planning specialist, Liz Olson, to call the roll. Ms. Olson?
Commissioner Risser. Here. Commissioner Jackson. Here. Commissioner Agnew. Here. Chair Hovland.
Here. Pledge of Allegiance is next, folks. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We've got a meeting agenda that's been published in advance of our meeting and is in front of us this morning. Is there anyone on the commission that wishes to modify the meeting agenda or from a staff standpoint? All right. Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Jackson, second by Commissioner Agnew to approve the meeting agenda as published. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the meeting agenda as published, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Now we are at the community comment portion of the agenda. Let's get that number back up on the screen. And then we'll first turn to residents in our audience that may wish to address the HRA on a matter of concern to them. Is there anybody in the audience that wishes to address the HRA on a matter that's not on the agenda this morning or scheduled for a future public hearing? Okay. All right. Let's go to the virtual world and see if we've got anybody tuning in that wants to address the HRA this morning.
I do have someone on the line, but that person has not yet signaled a desire to speak. As a reminder, if you'd like to speak, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. That's the asterisk symbol, then the number 1. That will get you in our queue to speak. I'm still not seeing. Oh, there it is. Operator, will you please unmute the line of our caller? And caller, please begin by stating your full name and address for the record.
Go ahead, caller. We're ready to listen to your comments.
Okay, my name is Andy Brown, 5512 Park Place in Edina. I'm really concerned about the overwhelming use of TIF and how it's affecting our school districts. And I would really ask the council and the HRA that they need to carve out the school district and public safety from all future TIF districts. I sent you a picture. There was a thing on KMSP about the release of a poor student that was literally run down on Xerxes Avenue. There was a 20-year-old that was arrested in Edina who was apparently planning a mass shooting event. We saw what happened in Nashville with the power of an M4 assault rifle, and there's no desire by current government to reduce Second Amendment rights and how that affects our schools. And there's also the mental welfare and the mental stability of our students and our teachers that is a really big issue, especially after COVID. And on the public safety issue, I mean, you have 4 intersections that are at grade, that are unguarded, that more than likely will have 100-car ethanol trains coming down the dam patch due to what the Met Council's actions were, establishing a multiple $multi-million bridge north of Methodist Hospital that can direct TC&W traffic directly to the dam patch. So I'm really frustrated with the HRA and the City Council. This is really corporate greed taking from our taxpayers and our school districts and our public safety needs that are not 26 years down the road, they're immediately. We have these needs immediately. And quite frankly, I'm very, very frustrated with council, with staff, with the HRA that those requirements are just not being addressed. And you want to know why people can't comment? I just got back from, dropping my son off at the bus stop. I just hope he comes home alive. That's all I ask for. And I shouldn't be having to sit here and pay money for projects in Edina that aren't even sustainable. You're just adding concrete and pavement and projects that should be paid for by developers. If they want to invest in Edina, that's fine, go ahead. But we need that money for the school districts, not to be putting in sidewalks and pavement and all this other stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Anyone else on the line? Okay. All right. Our practice is to follow up community comment with executive director's responses to any community comments that were made in the prior HRA meeting. Any comments to make, Executive Director Neal?
There aren't any comments to follow up on at this meeting. There certainly will be next meeting.
Okay. All right. Very good. Next, we have the consent agenda. Is there anyone on the HRA that wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Is there a motion to adopt the items on the consent agenda in a single motion?
So moved. I second.
Commissioner Brisser moves. Commissioner Agnew seconds the adoption of the items on the consent agenda in a single motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the motion as stated, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. The items on the consent agenda are approved. And now we are at the heart of our meeting this morning, and that is a presentation, no action required, but just our Bill Neuendorf is, along with our advisors, are going to make a presentation on the anticipated TIF redevelopment agreement for discussion purposes this morning. As I mentioned, no formal action will be required today. Manager Neuendorf.
Yes, good morning. I just want to do a quick mic check. Are you able to hear me and see my screen properly?
We've got a mic check going well, Bill, but I'm having trouble with your picture right now. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Well, Director Benarott is getting the picture up. Here we go. We have with us our HRA advisors, and we've got the developers here too available for questions. But Nick Anhut from Ellers, our HRA financial advisors here. Jay Lindgren and Alex Selke, our HRA legal advisors, are here. Ted Carlson and Drew Stafford from Orion are here as well, and Greg Brenny, their legal advisor, is here too. So go ahead, Manager Neuendorf, your presentation is on the screen and we're ready to go.
Great, sounds good. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, Bill Neuendorf, the city's economic development manager. My apologies that I'm not able to join you live in person this morning, but I am joining you live from the Chowan Park neighborhood here in Edina. What we wanted to do this morning was present the final draft of the redevelopment agreement with the 7250 France group that would enable the proposed office and then upcoming hotel project to proceed. So we'll summarize where we've been. I'm going to go through the past quickly because we've seen it before. And I really want to focus on the terms in this redevelopment agreement. As the chair mentioned, we do have our full staff available. The objective of this morning's conversation is to answer any questions you have and have a discussion. about this proposal. There is no action required today. Next week on the April 18th agenda, we will be seeking your action. We finished the public hearing on the potential creation of the new TIF district, and then we'll have the full, not final draft, but the final version of the TIF agreement in your packet for action next week. So our objective this morning is to familiarize this group with what we typically include in these types of contracts, and make sure that we've had an opportunity to address any questions that you might have so that you can make a full decision next week. And also, as the chair mentioned, while I'm at home this morning, we do have the full complement there. So Jay Lindgren at Dorsey and Whitney has been one of our leads for many years here in Edina on these type of large-scale redevelopment projects. He's ably assisted by Alex Selke, also at Dorsey, and Alex has done the majority of the drafting of this document. So if there's a trivia quiz about a particular section, that will go to Alex. And then Nick Anhut with Ellers Associates has been our bulldog that's been going through the proformas, looking at the projections, making sure that the gap that has been identified by the developer is legitimate. Again, Mr. Anhut has been an able advisor of the Edina HRA for many years, and they'll be the leads in most of our responses here this morning. Let's see. Now there we go. So the proposal in front of you this morning is the same one that we've been discussing for several months. The developer proposes to make an investment in the Edina community in excess of $160 million. That investment would include the new office building, a new hotel building, as well as nearly $10 million in public improvements or project upgrades that are extraordinary due to the existing conditions on the site and due to some of the new policies that the city has adopted. So over the last several months, we have analyzed that request. We've taken deep dives into the budget, looking at the returns, the potential returns, and we do believe that the gap is legitimate. And without using TIF, we don't think the developer will be able to secure the private financing required to build all the new infrastructure there. We have also documented over the years that the site does qualify as a redevelopment TIF district. We had gone through that presentation a few weeks ago. And back in February, this group reviewed a term sheet that identified the highlights of a potential financial effort by the HRA to help make this project viable. So the information in your packet this morning is based on that term sheet from February. And also just a reminder that that term sheet is rooted in our TIF policy, which was updated at the end of 2022. So that's a little bit about the background. The site itself, 7200 and 7250 France. This aerial shows the gravel pits that were in that area for many generations. And that's set the stage for eventual redevelopment. The two buildings were removed last year. One had been condemned as being unsafe, and then unfortunately during the pandemic years, they became heavy sources of vandalism and a lot of police activity that we wanted to put an end to. So this is a photo from last summer before they were taken down. The buildings were heavily vandalized. There was a fair number of shenanigans going on the property, a lot of dumping on the site, dumping garbage from fly dumpers. So working with the developer, they were able to secure the site as far as gaining title to it. They did work diligently trying to actually secure the property with fencing and boards. And that was a never-ending battle. Almost daily, there was somebody out there repairing it one day, and then someone would come and tear it down at night, and then they'd fix it again. So it had really become a blighting effect in that neighborhood, something that we're glad we can look forward to the next chapter. Other photos of the building from last summer. We'd also talked about the stormwater conditions. This is a map. The area in red is the western portion of the property, and it collects water for a lot of the, not just the properties themselves, but the adjacent parcels also drain into that area, and that's something that has to be addressed if we're ever going to redevelop this site. In the past, I'd mentioned all the various proposals that had been submitted, denied, rejected, withdrawn. You actually got one in 2019 that we thought was going to go forward, and they just couldn't get financing. It was too expensive of a project. Even with the use of TIF, it was still unable to be financed. And then working with this developer over the last year or so, I know they looked at several different concepts, from retail to banking to fire stations, offices, medical, et cetera, before they finally settled on what's in front of us today. When it comes to the use of TIF, you've seen this slide before. We're moving forward on this timeline. So today starts the conversation in our second step, where we're not just setting a budget, we're actually looking at a specific project that could be funded. A project that creates private development and public improvements, and those public improvements would come at no impact to the city's budget. Our development team is the same. Ted Carlson and Drew Stafford at Orion Investments, both Edina residents, both with great experience and great attitudes to move this project forward. There's been a lot of work on everyone's part to get it to this point. The site plan is the same as the last time we presented, a two-phase project. This is a rendering from the approved zoning plans and site plans. You see a lot of green space, a lot of trails, sidewalks, plazas, stormwater basins, etc. All those will be secured with easements, and then the two building pads are shown. I'm going to just fly through these. Of course, happy to answer questions when we're finished here. This is a slide I think is worth noting again. Over half of the property is going to be covered by permanent easements. So the sidewalks, the bike trail, the roadway, the plaza, the scenic overlook areas, all of those will have permanent public easements, which means that the developer pays for it, the general public gets to use it, and the developer will continue to maintain and repair it in the future so that it doesn't fall as a burden to the Public Works Department. I'm going to skip through a lot of these. We've talked about them at length. But these public realm benefits, the new roadway, the sidewalks, I think the only one that's really worth noting is the roadway. Many of the projects that were considered early, like back in 2015, 2016, 17, they were trying to develop the area one site at a time, which meant that we would never be able to get an access point to kind of shortcut from north to south. And that was one of the fatal flaws in some of those early proposals. So as we worked with this developer and also the previous one, it became very obvious that to actually get the zoning approved, they'd have to find a way where they could jointly develop both of these properties and include this new roadway going from the north to the south. That's one of the fundamentals in our Greater Southdale plan, and this proposal achieves that. There's one new public benefit or potential public benefit that I wanted to lay out to you this morning. This is new for the public conversation. Staff has been kind of thinking about this for the last several months, but there's a unique opportunity to the community. We potentially have sites across the street from each other that could be redeveloped at the same time. Everyone knows how difficult it can be to cross France Avenue. Even with the crosswalks that we installed, oh gosh, about 8 years ago at this point, If you recall, back in 2007, one of the concepts was to put a bridge, a singular bridge over France Avenue. And ultimately, that concept was abandoned because we didn't think there was enough benefit. With only one bridge, you've got to walk a long way to get to that bridge. Then when you get to the other side, you've got to walk a long way to your final destination. So back in 2014, we instead chose to make many improvements to the sidewalks and crosswalks so that multiple neighborhoods could cross the street more easily. But with both of these properties potentially being redeveloped at the same time, it reinvigorated that discussion about how do you cross France. And one commonality in both of these site plans is having a centrally located pedestrian public plaza. And so that we started pursuing, in fact, working with Chad Milner, our city engineer. He worked with an engineering group to take a quick conceptual study to see that if this is even worth, having a real discussion. So what's shown on the screen here is a potential pedestrian underpass that would connect from the public plaza on this project, going underneath France Avenue, and then coming up at the site of the Macy's Furniture Store, which Enclave Development is currently proposing to reconstruct. We've not worked through any of the details at all, but the engineering company did look at 4 different options. They looked at an above-ground bridge, and then they looked at 3 different ways to build something below grade. And the concept that is shown on the screen here is what the engineering company thinks has the most merit to actually proceed. So still a lot of details to work through. But I would love your input on whether or not you think this is worth pursuing. This is an excerpt from our 2007 pedestrian study. Our city engineer, Chad Milner, found this one in the archives. We've not looked at this one for a while. But it's interesting that on this block is where there was a clear need for safe pedestrian crossings across France Avenue. And in that study, it was shown to be somewhere in this approximate location. And I know this is hard to envision without actually seeing it, but another example, and again, kudos to City Engineer Milner, this is a pedestrian underpass that's actually under construction today in Chaska. It goes under a state roadway, and so you've got a pedestrian and bicycle path that goes under the road. You still have sidewalks to serve the adjacent buildings. And then parallel to the road, you also still have a sidewalk, in our case, to go from the north to the south. So again, when we're finished, we're happy to answer any questions. I think Mr. Milner is in the best position to answer any detailed questions that you might have. But again, we'd be looking for your indication whether or not we should look further or whether or not we should just not. We'd also talked about the stormwater management. That's still happening with a stormwater basin for this that would serve this property as well as the surrounding properties. On the sustainability front, the 2 buildings that are proposed here would meet our TIF policy, which means that not only do they meet our sustainable building policy, which would require a basic LEED certification, but that would be upgraded to a LEED Silver rating or better. Of course, they'd have the electrical vehicle chargers on site. They would design the rooftops to be solar ready, so that when it made sense to add panels, they'd be more readily available to do that. But upgrading from having no certification to having the minimum certification to having more than the minimum adds millions of dollars of cost upfront that will be recouped over time eventually by the tenants and the visitors to the building. But that really is a fantastic add for this building. To my knowledge, there's no other building in Edina that currently has this LEED Silver certification. So this is something we really want to promote and get more of so that our future looks more sustainable than our past did. We've also worked quite a bit with A&P Construction, who would be the general contractor on the project, where we've identified goals to ensure that people that have historically been left out of the construction field have a greater opportunity for employment, as well as for subcontracting business opportunities. So we've identified some percentage goals. I want to stress these are goals. They're not minimums. They're not mandates. State law does not allow us to do that. But there would be a penalty. If they fall a little bit short of the goals, we cannot penalize them for that. But we have laid out terms where we define best efforts. Actually, it's good faith efforts is what we've defined. And so if the contractors fail to apply those good faith efforts to achieve these goals, that's where the penalty would apply. It's unlikely we'd ever see that penalty, but if it were to be applicable, the funds do not go to the city. That's not our goal. Those funds would go to a workforce development program. There's several in the Twin Cities, but the idea is that we really want to do a better job of including groups of people that have been left out of this field. So let's talk about the project a little bit more. These numbers should look familiar. Total investment of about $160 million. Now this is an upfront investment that the developer has the full responsibility for. This will be their equity and their debt in the project. We're recommending that the city make a pledge of TIF, which means that when the project is successfully finished in each of those two phases, we would essentially issue an IOU or a TIF note to the developer. And from those additional future taxes that they create, we would reimburse them for that portion of the project, the $7.5 million, plus the interest that's paid to the bank. So I just want to stress that all financial risk rests with the developer. Our TIF policy strongly cautions against the city assuming any financial risk of a private development, and we've certainly followed our policy on this project. When the project is finished, the estimated market value will increase tremendously, as well as the taxes that are generated from the site. Today, the property pays about $350,000 annually in property taxes. The biggest percentage of that goes to the state, but about between 12 and 20% goes to the city, the county, and the schools to continue to fund the basic operations and basic services that are provided. When the project is finished, it's expected to generate over $2 million in annual property taxes. So that'll be the source to repay the TIF pledge, the IOU. But when the project is finished, when that obligation of the city is paid off, those additional taxes go to the city, the schools, the county, the state, and everybody else. So it's that tremendous growth that we're really focused on. One other point I want to bring up, though, is also hotel revenue. Years ago, the city of Edina did apply a 3% lodging tax on every hotel in Edina. And that lodging tax, notably, it's much lower than our surrounding communities as far as a percentage. But those monies are collected by the city. By state law, they can only be used to promote tourism and convention type opportunities, to bring visitors to our community, to support the restaurants and the shops and all the retail areas. So when the city created that tax years ago, there was a decision about how to spend those monies, how to get them on the street for their intended purpose. There was consideration about given to hiring additional city staff to run that program. And ultimately it was decided that it would be better to engage with an independent group called Explore Edina, who is an affiliate of the Edina Chamber of Commerce. So their staff are the ones that receive these monies to invest on behalf of the city of Edina. All the monies that are collected must be spent for those visitor type purposes, and that group does make a report at least annually to show how they've been doing that and what their plans are for the upcoming year. So that's an additional revenue created on the site that we haven't really talked about before, but as this hotel becomes more viable, I think it's worthy to note that. Looking back to the budget, this is just a summary of the construction costs to do all the site work, the demolition, the site prep, all the landscaping, all the roadways, the path, the bike path, sidewalks, etc. About $160 million. Just under $10 million of that is eligible as a TIF reimbursable expense. So I know that might be confusing, so let me clarify that. We're recommending that we cap the TIF pledge to $7.55 million, but what this chart shows is they're creating and incurring nearly $10 million in direct benefit costs to the public, as well as addressing some unique situations on the site, like the demolition of the half of the decrepit building, etc. This is a chart that Mr. Anhut at Ellers prepared. It just shows, the green bar shows the average growth, tax-based growth in Edina. These blue bars show the tax-based growth of these properties. The point being that the tax-based growth here far exceeds the average, and that's what we like. That's what creates the long-term benefit for the community. That's what we like to see. We've also done our homework, and I know this particular slide is not a priority of Councilmember Pierce. You've mentioned that in the past. But anytime we use TIF, we have to apply two tests. In Edina, we make sure that there's public benefits delivered. That's not even required by state law, but that's something we do here in Edina. But what state law does require is an assurance that we're not over-subsidizing the developer. We have to confirm that but for these funds, the project will not move forward. And that's what this slide summarizes, that without TIF, the project doesn't create a market return that would be able to secure financing. But with TIF, we believe we can secure that financing. So this is a summary of that conclusion. This shows the same thing in a tabular type format. So here's our recommended terms, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Again, the developer bears all financial risk. The developer is responsible for securing the debt and the equity, and we've identified aggressive but reasonable deadlines to move. We want to see the site cleaned up and restored and vibrant sooner than later. We're recommending that the HRA pledge up to $7.55 million. That would be reimbursement after each phase of the project is complete. We're recommending two TIF notes. The first to go along with phase one. That TIF note would be $5.9 million. The second note would be up to $1.6 million. And the second note would be payable after the hotel is finished. Anytime we issue TIF notes, we have conditions to make payments. Again, these are basically a reward for achieving all the public goals that were initially stated. So after the project is finished, we'll issue the note, but the note is only payable when all the requirements are met. The project is completed. That list of public benefits, the sidewalks, trails, roadways, etc., are finished and delivered. The developer, of course, remains in good standing. And then fundamentally, and most importantly, the developer has to pay their property taxes. We'll make payments on that note from 90% of their tax payments. The remaining 10% will be withheld by the city to cover administrative costs. And any leftover portions, because we don't think we'll need the full 10% for administration, So the leftover amount would be pooled to support affordable housing projects elsewhere in the city. And then, of course, another fundamental of TIF is that those basic taxes, like, for example, the $350,000 paid this year, those continue to go to the city, the schools, and the county to make sure that all the basic services are still being financed and can be delivered. In Edina, we employ a method called a certificate of completion, which is a great way to document that the developer has achieved all those goals. So we've got a form that we've been using for the last several projects. Of course, we'll mimic that on this project. But I think importantly, when it comes to sizing those notes, I just want to provide a reassurance that at this point in time, that $7.55 million TIF note is a maximum, and it's an estimate. So when the project is actually finished, we won't look at the estimated costs, we're looking at the actual costs. And the city holds the right that we might reduce the value of that TIF note if it appears that the developer doesn't need that much to meet his market return. So there is contractual language that gives the city the right to reduce that note, whether that's one note, two notes, or not, but we have that right. And I think that's vital to protect our interest. And then also looking out into the future, at some point, we want to confirm that the but-for is still satisfied in the long term. So at some point in time, it's likely that the properties might be sold. And then also at some point in time, we're going to near the end of our payment obligations to the developer. So we've structured a way to look at the financials in the future and ensure that TIF was used to support the project, but not to over-subsidize the project. And we've got contractual language that if we do find the amount of TIF used was not necessary, that we used too much, the city does have clawback provisions where, depending on the actual situation, we can either terminate payments, and in some instances, if we've paid in and it turns out they didn't need the money, we have the rights to claw it back. And that second phase note, so about up nearly $2 million, would be returned to the city as a clawback. Now, we don't think this is actually going to happen. We've scrutinized these budgets very well. We see what the interest rate is like. We're looking at and cognizant of what construction prices are. But again, any time that we do a TIF contract, we explore all these different possibilities to make sure that the taxpayers of Edina are getting not just a fair deal, but the best deal. So in summary, we've prepared a TIF agreement. The heart of that is in your packet. Those blighted buildings have already been eliminated. Back in February, the zoning and the overall site plan was approved by the City Council. It was also supported by the Planning Commission last fall. We have confirmed that they've got nearly $10 million in TIF eligible expenses. We're willing to support a TIF note up to $7.55 million. Our legal counsels, both Dorsey and Whitney and Campbell and Knutson, have prepared permanent easements to secure those public improvements. And we've worked with our HRA advisor at Ellers to confirm that without TIF, this project delivers below market returns and would not be built. It would not be financed. We've also made sure to include safeguards to protect and prevent excessive profits in both the short term and the long term. So with that, we feel that we have not only satisfied the terms in that term sheet, but also the conditions in our TIF policy. Staff does recommend we move forward with this project and with this agreement next week. But this is the end of my report, and I want to make sure that we have opportunity to answer any questions you might have and proceed. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Manager Neuendorf. Very thorough presentation again. I know that with the exception of the first time now we're seeing the idea of a possible connection underground between I'll call it the Cornelia neighborhood and east side of France Avenue. We've looked at this a couple of different times with you and walked through a lot of different things. Nonetheless, I'm sure that there are HR commissioners that have questions, and I know that Commissioner Jackson was eager to start out with a few questions that she has. So I'm going to let her start in, and I know I have some, but I'll cover my colleagues before I get to any of my questions, and then they may well cover some of them as well. So Commissioner Jackson.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I do have a lot of questions. The first one is from slide 32, and I think this might be for Nick Anhut from Ellers, for Mr. Anhut. This is the pro forma of what developers make, and I'd like to just get a sense of what the financial markets are, why we have these numbers of what's acceptable return for developers, and just kind of the background of how we develop that.
Sure, thank you, members of the board. Nick Anhut from Ellers & Associates, financial advisor to the HRA and the city. So we do look at comparable market activity at the time we negotiate any kind of a TIF agreement. So when you're looking to finance development, a bank or a lender is going to apply certain criteria for which they'll be able to lend funds to this project. They look at the expected rents of the facility, what kind of revenue it's going to generate, and whether or not that's going to cover the risk should there be any sort of default on that loan obligation. Typically, a bank is going to require somewhere between 20 to even 40% of equity, so that's funds, cash, upfront invested in the project, and the debt to bridge the remaining amount of the cost. And then the future revenue from that project needs to be able to cover the payments on that debt. So those are the primary mechanisms that we look at, and understanding that today interest rates are much higher than they have been for the last couple of years. So that's why some of these percentages that are on the slide are a little bit higher than what you've seen in the past, and we're just reflecting the fact that it's harder to obtain capital in today's market, in the private marketplace. You need to be able to cover a higher interest expense. You need to be able to cover the costs associated with rising cost to procure materials and labor, and so that's why those rates are a little bit higher than you've seen in the past. But that's the lens that we tend to look at. We need to look at the developer's ability to obtain capital to invest in this project, because the city is not providing any funding up front, nor are we guaranteeing any of that.
So I just want to summarize what I heard, and that is that the developer has to make a certain margin in order to secure financing, and then that the banks and the lenders also have constraints on what they're able to finance based on the risk of a project. So if the developer were to make less money than what's proposed, that would increase the risk and probably decrease the ability of their ability to get financing. And that's not, that's a pretty highly regulated, on the bank side anyways, transaction. Is that a fair summary?
I think that is a fair summary. They would have the opportunity to put all cash into the deal, but there would be no expectation that they would get any kind of return on that investment. So they do need to obtain some kind of debt or bank financing to move ahead and balance the difference, so that they have a profitable project, but then B, that they're able to cover all those regulations and those obligations from the banks. In this case, when we look at it and we take the TIF off the table, the private returns and the revenues that are generated from renting these facilities do not cover the debt payments that are necessary, and they do not cover what we would call a fair return on investment. They're substantially below market, substantially below some other much safer investments that could be made in things like bonds or other investment vehicles. So we do think they are meager. We do think that the assistance would be necessary. In the case of the HRA, it's presented in the form of tax increment as a tool that can be used to kind of bridge that divide. If it were pledged to this project, it would get those levels of return and debt coverage in a place that we do think they will be able to obtain financing in the private markets.
Terrific. Thank you so much. My next question is, Well, there's the one that I don't even know how to ask this question, but I wonder, and I see Mr. Teague is here, and this might be for Bill, or for Mr. Newendorf, or for Mr. Teague, and that is, when projects come forward and are rejected, and then they come forward and they are rejected, what's the response that we hear from the private markets in whether they want to do business in the city of Edina? Does this, I would say maybe is like, I don't know what slide it is that shows the accepted, rejected, but what does that do for the probability of the quality of the next project coming forward? Do you have any insights in that, or is that just speculative at this point?
You know, I'll jump on that first, and Carrie, feel free to add anything. Board member, I think it's fairly speculative. Okay. When a project is proposed, what the development community likes the best is to either get a quick no or a quick yes, because when they're dragged out to a long maybe, it just costs a lot of time and a lot of money. So for most of these projects, the ones that were denied, those are pretty quick no's. It was obvious that they were too much. So I don't think those had a negative impact to us. The project in 2019 might be a little bit different, though. That was the one we actually got zoning approval for it. But along the way, there were several conditions added by various city policymakers along the way that added a whole lot of cost to that project and no revenue to cover those costs. So that one, I think there's probably a bad taste in some people's mouths on that one, just because it took so long to get through. And by the time we approved it, it was so expensive it couldn't be built.
Okay, thank you.
So it's different for every project.
Great, thank you. And then the fun one, and this is maybe for Mr. Lindgren and Mr. Selke, or for Mr. Milner, the crossing of France Avenue safely. This is super exciting development. And I guess the first question for our bond attorneys is there anything in this proposal that we're looking at that would preclude using TIF money for a project that crosses France? So just to make sure we're not closing off that avenue of that option.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, good morning. Again, for the record, Jay Lindgren with Dorsey and Whitney, Special Counsels to the Authority. I think the only thing that would preclude the use of TIF is the fact that we're creating this TIF district and, and proposing to utilize that increment to help create this project. But if your question is if there's a source of increment, say from the east side of France, this would be a qualified cost. Clearly, you can build public infrastructure of this type, like this safe crossing, with the use of increment. I think that's your question.
Well, it is, and I think you got to it, that this particular agreement that we're reviewing today and talking about would not include a crossing of France.
This particular agreement creates all the tools that would allow the city to decide that it can find financing to create the underpass and do it in a way that coordinates with the Orion project on the west side. It doesn't identify what that funding is, but we've established the timing so that we could come within the easement area that is the public plaza that's proposed and work with the developer to change that design to create that entry point. So we're creating a window of time that hopefully allows people to figure it out.
Okay. Oh, that's great news. Thank you. And then Mr. Milner, tell us about the sort of cost differentials between going over France and the engineering problems with going over versus going under, and what the timing would be of ironing those details out.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioners. We looked at those four options. The bridge is not feasible. There's not enough landing space on each side to make that connection on a bridge, but we want to just investigate it to see if it was possible. Having these two potential projects opened up that idea of a tunnel, because we know that the Nine Mile Creek Regional Trail crosses right at Gallagher. We get a lot of questions and concerns about how can we improve those crossings on France. So we looked at a really deep option, and then we looked at the option you saw on the screen was kind of the most feasible. It's a $4 to $6 million estimated cost. It is a very high level estimate at this point. The benefit of, at that point in France, there's no sanitary sewer pipes that we have to go around. So there's water main, which is easily adjusted, and storm pipes, which we found could be adjusted a little differently layout across on France or around that Macy's site. So there's just an opportunity right now to do it. With any tunnel, you saw the graphics, we want to make it feel safe, feel lighted. We could put some art and paint murals on that stuff, so that's kind of the thing. The only challenging piece would be water, because whether or not that tunnel has enough grade just to drain by gravity to the west or to the east, or do we have to have a small sump pump in there for potential water that would come in from rain events or snow melts?
Okay, terrific, thank you. And then this is a question for both you and for the developer, and that is, can we look for Infrastructure Act dollars to pay for either this bridge or the water mitigation? Are we looking for grant opportunities?
As a city, I'm looking for grant opportunities for any kind of, there's a safe streets grant right now to see if we're eligible for that, and there's various other ones with the infrastructure bill that we're looking at for pedestrian facilities. So yes, I'm looking at that. Stormwater, I'm not aware of any of those at this. Typically that's flooding and resiliency, and those typically score higher along the coast, east coast, west coast, with that type of flooding, not these local flood shapes that we're seeing in our city.
Terrific. All right, thank you. That's all my questions,
All right,
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Agnew.
Mr. Miller, while you're up here, I'll just continue on questions about the potential, I'll call it an underpass for now, or undercrossing. So we were talking a little bit about the financing for that. What is, maybe this isn't necessarily for you, but what is preventing us from including the funding for this in the TIF district that we have today?
You know, I'll respond to that, and then, or it looks like, Nick, are you ready to go?
Yes, Nick's up at the podium.
Awesome.
Not to jump ahead. What is pledged to this project right now are the taxes, or the incremental taxes that are generated from this specific development. We have pledged 90% of it in order to bridge the gap in what's already included as a cost to this project. So there is a small portion, at 10%, that we could potentially use to help finance additional costs on this project, but we haven't, we don't have the capability within the project that's proposed. It would be an add-on that we would need to find another source of either revenue or available funds to pay for. If we were to add it to the cost of their project, it would exceed the expected TIF that we would expect from this development, and we would need to figure out if there's another city source of funds that could bridge that gap, or something else, but it's not available within the project itself right now.
Okay, and so just to help me understand, when we initially created this TIF district, we had talked about the potential cap of the $34 million, and that's what we discussed when we met last time. Can you kind of communicate to me the difference between that $34 million and what you're viewing as the potential maximum for this TIF district?
Yeah, so the budget for the TIF district was created based on the zoning that's in place on the site, which includes the ability to develop the office building that is anticipated, as well as potentially a 150-unit multifamily or residential building. A lot of this has to do with the way taxes are calculated, but when a residential property comes to a community, a very high percentage of the property taxes created from that development are kept locally. And the state does not have a property tax that it imposes on residential property. The property doesn't contribute to the fiscal disparities pool that's metro-wide, so there's a lot more of that tax base that's directly captured locally. And so why that number is so much larger if this was a multifamily is we would have much more potential local property tax revenue to essentially play with. This proposal is assuming that there's a hotel built on the northern portion of the property. That would generate taxes, but it would be significantly less than what that budget was built off of. So if there was a pivot to a different type of use on that property, yes, I would acknowledge that there might be more that could be carved out and used for additional costs on the development, but not if it is a hotel as is envisioned today. And this agreement contemplates it being a hotel.
Thank you. So one of the things that Mr. Neuendorf mentioned is that, and it's related to the potential taxes from a hotel due to the lodging taxes. So maybe this is something that I just need to learn more about, because Mr. Neuendorf, that was the first time I had, kind of understood the nuances of that lodging tax. But why are our lodging taxes so much lower, and is that what's playing a role in this, or do all of those lodging taxes go direct to, I forget what it was called, the Explore Edina, and is that then not even relevant at all to this conversation?
I'm going to have our Executive Director, Manager Neal, answer that question because he's involved in that.
Commissioner Agnew, members of the commission. Yes, I would say it's unrelated. There are communities that have higher lodging taxes than we do. Bloomington and Minneapolis are two, but they have their lodging taxes were approved by the legislature under special legislation. What we were able to do in 2014, I believe was the year that we did it, 2013, we availed ourselves of the statutory lodging tax that the City Council could adopt on its own volition. So that was a 3% number. It hasn't changed during that time. As Mr. Neuendorf noted, we pledge all of that directly to Explore Edina, a subsidiary organization of the Chamber. The mayor and I are both on the board of directors of that organization, and so we get to see how that money is deployed in the community.
Thank you. So, thank you very much for that. Did you have an add-on to that?
I would just add that for purposes of tax increment, those are all property tax that we're talking about being captured. That does not include the capture of any other imposed tax. So not included in our analysis would be any lodging tax that would benefit the community, any additional sales tax activity that would benefit the community. Those would all continue to fund the things that they are funding today or are expected to fund here in the short term. We are solely talking about the property tax revenue when we're talking about a TIF district. So they are separate pots of money. They go to separate uses, and this would not preclude the ability to use those for the purposes that they're designed for.
Thank you. When we think about the timing then and the potential design for this undercrossing, what does that look like, and what would be the next steps if we were to pursue this?
Yeah, and maybe Bill can chime in on this one too, but I mean, we have approved plan on the west side, and we have just an idea and a sketch plan, I think it's coming before you in the next few weeks. So it's getting parties talking to each other and actually getting something approved on the other side, I think is the key to my mind. We know it's feasible, we know it's possible, we know our residents want something better there. We just want to make sure stuff isn't built or too far designed with the current project that it doesn't allow us to do it in the future. So how do we work with the current applicants to set it up for that potential change in the future? So the timing's a little off between the parties, but we're closer than what we typically are, where there's many years between two projects. So I don't know if, Bill, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the next step would be for the city to explore this idea a little bit more in depth. This is just the first pass. We did not want to go too far down the road without your consent and support. So over the decades, there's been talk about crosswalks, bridges, and underpasses. If you have one strong preference over the other, let us know. But this initial look looks like the underpass is the only realistic option. But if you so direct us, we are happy to explore it a little bit further and take it as far as we can while working with the two developers.
Have we started having conversations with the county yet, too, about what that would look like going under France?
No, that's kind of the next, to make sure there was support from the various bodies here.
Okay, because where I'm going with this too is, you know, a portion of what this financing would go towards is that public plaza. And I continue to be concerned with the public plaza in general. It doesn't feel to me like it's public. It feels like it's an amenity for the office building that's there. And so when that's one of my concerns, and on the other side, I get really excited thinking about connecting these two sides of France. I'm thinking, you know, is an investment in the public plaza a moot point if it's going to be changed and created into an underpass at that area? So that's where kind of my mind goes of, if we could pursue the underpass faster and really change what that plaza looks like, does that alleviate the concerns that I have about the plaza as it stands today?
Well, I think what I'm hearing, and probably Nick could chime in, is using those dollars on the west side, if we tweak the plaza to have a opening for a tunnel, those seem like those same dollars could be a public benefit, whether it's an entrance to a tunnel or a plaza. But I'd have to have them discuss if that's feasible or not.
Thank you.
You know, let me chime in on that as well. So in the redevelopment agreement, Mr. Selke could give you the exact section number, but we did make provision in there where if the city can provide direction sooner than later to the developer, like if they start building the plaza in its current arrangement, then it gets more expensive because we have to undo what was just done. So in the redevelopment agreement, there is language to work together, but certainly our intention would be to, you know, if we like this idea, we should figure it out sooner than later and not waste money.
Thank you. Okay, so my last question then, and I think that this is for either for Mr. Neuendorf or for our tax partners, but in the past we've seen a graph. I think of it as the Vikings graph because it's purple and yellow, but it really showed kind of like the incremental over time and how part of it was the incremental that went back to the project, and then the next part of it, and it wasn't in today's packet, so that's why I'm just referring to it as the Vikings graph. But then in the future, it showed the portions that were going to, I think it was referred to as all agencies. I would really love to understand more of that and see that breakdown, especially as we talk about taxes to schools and talk about how these taxes are actually going to be used down the road, and understanding when there is that lift due to market value, how I understand based off of that graph, even in the short term, there is going to be incremental addition to taxes like that's going to schools. But I would just love to see a little bit more of a breakdown of that graph. And if you have comments to say on that right now, I'd definitely welcome those. But even at a future meeting, I think that would really help, especially as we're having discussions with residents too, to just show that, as I understand that in the short term, there still is that incremental increase, but then down the road, how much more beneficial it would be to our community too.
Mr. Ranhut.
Thank you. I'll attempt without the visual, but essentially the property as it exists today is about $10 million worth of property value that's contributing to the local tax base. So that's for the city, the county, and the school district. When we use things like TIF is designed specifically so that that value is still contributing and still a part of the local tax base. As new development occurs and that value of the property appreciates, there is an incremental portion. So above the 10 million that exists today, that is captured essentially within a TIF district. It's a separate pot of money that's segregated. They still pay taxes the same as any other property within the community. It's just the portion that is equivalent to that increase is separately remitted to the HRA, and the HRA gets to use those funds to help assist the development. In this case, we're going to use 90% of them to reimburse the upfront investment that the developer is making to deliver these projects and all the benefit items that Bill mentioned earlier. When the TIF district expires or when it's shut down, so it's met all of its financial obligations, it's reimbursed the developer for everything that was invested up front, and it's serviced all the other potential uses that the HRA might like to do in the future, pool that money for other affordable housing, find out another mechanism how to pay for the underpass, whatever it is. At that point in time when the TIF district is shut down, then all of that new value reverts to the local tax bases that are contributing toward the general budgets of the school district, the city, and the county. I would just say, though, that it doesn't mean that those budgets are necessarily going to increase. The policymakers in charge of those communities are fully available to set their budgets as they need to service their annual obligations, provide the services that you want to provide to your citizens. TIF district doesn't preclude your ability to do that. It just means that this property will not be contributing to that, to those existing taxpayers or taking on a share of those costs in that interim period. It's going to reimburse the specific investments that are made to help bring this new project forward, to pay for those, and then when it's done paying for those, then all of that value can revert and be potentially used to help fund operations in the future. But it doesn't take away from any funding at all. It's designed specifically to do that.
As a segue from that, before I go to Commissioner Risser, because it's a related question, and that is that when a TIF district is proposed, and this may be for either Mr. Selke or Mr. Lindgren as well, we talk to those other taxing districts, and they have an opportunity to opine as to whether or not they think it would be, they'd be neutral, it would be advantageous or detrimental to them. And have we had those contacts yet with the school district and the county?
Yes, Mr. Chair. As part of the process to establish a TIF district, there is a requirement that the City of Edina, the HRA, provide the budget for the TIF district as well as any fiscal implications of creating this tool. We have to provide that 30 days before the public hearing is held, the public hearing that was just held at the City Council level at its last meeting. There have been no comments from the county or the school district. Again, we provide them all of the calculations, all of the expected increase in the tax base, the potential benefits. We are also supposed to identify whether or not there'll be any increased operating expenses to the city in considering this proposal and this specific piece of property. And so there are engineering estimates for the potential new revenue that could be created. We don't anticipate that there's any new costs from public works to plow the side street. These are all private, the sidewalks and all of those things. We think that there might be some potential increase in maybe public safety expenses because we're bringing new density to the area, but we're also taking away from a lot of attention that's been paid to this site over the last couple of years with repeated visits from the police department because of some of the vandalism and other things that are happening on that site. So there's potentially an offset there, but we are required to come up with estimates of all of those potential implications and provide those to the public in advance of that consideration.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Commissioner Risser. I'm sure she's got some questions as well.
Thank you, and I want to thank Director Neuendorf for pulling together slides that I felt really were important to discuss. And one of the things that we have heard repeatedly is the connection with zoning and how that ties into TIF calculation. And also, for me, I think looking at this project as a whole, I have a lot of concerns about it. And I know when we first voted for a study on TIF, I did not vote for that. One of the biggest concerns I had is that I didn't know what I was voting for. There was a lot of ambiguity, and I think there still is a lot of ambiguity. And I don't know if Mr. Neuendorf can pull the slides that you just had up. That would be fantastic. If you look at the term sheet for the TIF district, one of the things that it says is point C, this is on page 2, regarding the project, the overall project is described in the planning document submitted to the city and approved through Ordinance 2022-13 and Resolution 2023-11 on February 7th, 2023. Those items were approved in the consent agenda. And I really try to do my homework and see everything that is happening. And I was really focused. It was a bundled item. It was the zoning ordinance amendment, rezoning, the revised overall development plan, the site plan approval, phase 1, phase 2, and site improvement plan agreement. That was my focus because I'm really concerned about safety. And I missed it. I missed that we were changing the principal uses from office to PCD2 zoning. And as you read what is allowed in this PUD 16 now, principal uses, all uses allowed in the PCD zoning district, multifamily apartments, as well as, and then you can have accessory uses, all of the accessory uses in the PCD2 zoning district. And Bill, I don't know if we can get that this show you just had up. I'm sorry, Mr. Neuendorf, with the transition zones and all of that. So, my question, if you're looking at the existing land use and the future land use that is in our comprehensive plan, it is office residential for future land use, it is straight up office for current. Now it is PCD2. How did we do that in a consent agenda item, and why is this not something that has to be amended in our comprehensive plan? So just real high level, what is that? And Mr. Neuendorf, if we could go to the list of things that are allowed in the PCD2 district, that would be helpful. All of these are principal uses that are allowed, and I do want to point out there's so much ambiguity here. Ground floor retail could be anything, okay? We don't know. The development could be sold to somebody else. They might have a different vision. So that is something that I think, really is a concern for me. And all of this started because I was trying to figure out how we got from office and residential to office and hotel. And when I go back and I look at what was approved on October 18th, the resolution creating this amended PUD zoning, there is nothing about a hotel. It pops up in the item, one of the three items that were bundled together in the February 7th consent agenda. So, I feel like it's really, really hard to wrap my head around this. The other thing is, can we go to the map that shows the transition zone? Okay, this is part of our Greater Southdale Area Design Guideline. And you can see that the project area falls right in that transition zone. And this is our buffer. It is to make it a very reasonable kind of development. And I think if we are not following our comprehensive plan, all of these studies that we have done, it really turns things around in a way that I think is most unsettling. And I feel like as we move forward with projects, what we're doing is kind of muddying our zoning. And so now we have the property PCD2, and then when I was reading what Macy's wants to do, apparently at that site, one of the ideas is to go to office. Okay, so it's just everything is kind of topsy-turvy, and that really matters for so many people, but it really, really matters. I've heard from residents of this area, and they are wondering what is going on. And the other thing too is, this is, if you look, and we listed the zoning, or excuse me, the uses around this parcel. I don't think we had R1. That is kitty corner from the site, but that is very close to it. So, how did we get a hotel? We got a hotel, affirmation for the hotel on February 7th in the consent agenda item. At least that's my read. It's possible I'm a little bit off on this, but that is my take at this point. So that is a concern that I have. The other concern that I have on page 12 of the term sheet, and this has to do with DEI, and I don't know who would be the person to ask about this. from the development team? I'm not sure. Okay, I'll just ask it. Well, the question is, we're talking about how we're going to encourage diversity, and if you look at the previous page, the developer will commit to use good faith efforts to cause its contractor to try to achieve workforce and minority women-owned business goals to maximize participation opportunities for the local workforce, including women and minorities. These goals will be specified in the redevelopment agreement. Then you go to the next page. These goals are expressed as a percentage of the total craft hours on the project. Could you please talk about what falls into the category of craft hours for work and what other divisions of labor are involved in the project?
Bill, you want me to take that? I can.
Yeah, let's go in reverse order. If you could address, either Jay or Alex could address the phrasing of craft hours.
And I think craft hours in my mind really means tradespeople. It means those kinds of, typically the construction workers that are actually working on, whether they're for the general contractor or the subcontractor, so from basic construction work to electrical, blah, blah, blah. Those are what I think are craft hours.
So that's the type of work where we're really putting emphasis on opportunities for women and minorities? Why not the entire work that will be connected to this project? Why not management? Why not technology? Other, I'm not that familiar with all of the different categories, but to just limit this to the craft work, I think is short-sighted.
Sure, I think that's a fair public policy question. I think as someone that works on these kind of equity programs in public-private partnerships regularly, I think what we're talking about now is that there is a construction project. And so in part because there's the potential to utilize public funds to do that, we're in a position to say, please make sure you look to these diverse parties to participate and then set the goals. The larger question of whether or not you could have goals that are established to what the diversity is of the people that work within the buildings, it seems to me that's a much larger public policy question. I mean, because what we're dealing with at the moment is construction.
Right.
Is that your question? Or?
Sorry to interrupt, but as I was reading, it isn't just craft people who will be associated with the construction. There's other categories of workers with the construction, not just craft.
Well, I think that's true, certainly. I think, but what I've seen most typically is because the vast number of workers that will physically be there doing something are probably in that craft or trades area, right? There certainly are engineers and architects and other people working there. I think historically the reason that these programs exist is because there were fewer opportunities for minorities and for women to participate in those construction projects, and so this is a tool to build that base. So I think the vast number of workers that we're talking about on a site like this are craft workers. So.
Okay, and when I'm looking at page 23 that lists the job groups, I'm seeing managers and administrators, professionals and technicians. So it does look like there's operatives. So yeah, and you do have skilled crafts, office and clerical, sales workers, service workers. So I just, that jumped out at me, why limit it? But thank you.
Did you want the Director Teague to answer that question of how we got to the zoning PCD2?
I would, and I'd also like to know why we don't have to do a comprehensive plan amendment.
Thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. So when the first reading of the ordinance took place in October, and when the overall development plan was approved on a preliminary basis in October, and when the traffic study, parking study, we were assuming multifamily residential for that phase 2. The zoning ordinance establishing the PUD did refer to the planned commercial district. Hotels are listed as a permitted use within that PCD 2 district. Also, at that October meeting, the developer referenced the possibility of doing hospitality within this site. That said, they haven't received final site plan approvals for Phase 2. That was the sketch plan that you all reviewed a month or so ago. We're updating the parking and traffic study to examine that hotel use. And there's still some issues with that. They're short parked. That was brought up at the sketch plan review. By code, they're about 150 stalls short. The parking study is showing they're still about 100 stalls short. So a hotel has not been specifically approved yet for the site. In regard to the comprehensive plan, within the office residential land use description, service type uses are listed as a permitted use. Limited retail and service type uses are allowed within that district. If we go back to 2018 with the Southdale Office Center site, where a PUD was approved for that site, again on the west side of France, there is a hotel that's been approved for that site as well. So no comprehensive plan amendment would be needed.
So to be clear, that land is not zoned PCD2.
The 7200 site?
Phase 2?
Yeah, both, either of those properties.
It's zoned PUD.
No,
It's PUD, but PCD, any PCD2 use is allowable.
Correct.
Okay, and we don't have to do a comprehensive plan amendment for that.
Correct.
I think we need to look very closely at how we're handling zoning. And the other issue, it came up at the city council meeting last time, the idea of rewriting our PCD1 zoning so that you can have entirely residential in that commercial. That I want to go on record as saying I am strongly opposed to that. I think it will have a devastating impact on our neighborhood nodes. And I can see them just totally disappearing, being replaced. And we've already had 3 parcels that are now fully residential that are supposed to have commercial use on it. And this just does not make sense. So thank you.
Dr. Teague, I still think you need to answer a little bit more in more detail the question of how did we get to PCD2?
Within the PUD zoning ordinance that was passed, it was listed as a permitted principal use, all uses within the PCD2 district. The idea behind that was, again, in that preliminary approval, there was 10,000 square feet of retail proposed for Phase 2, and the PCD2 zoning is the vehicle that would get us there. We do have PCD2 zoning on the west side of France, room and board, within the between 69th in France and 70th in France on that west side. There's a few properties zoned PCD2 there as well.
Yep. So the fundamental question is how did we get to PUD that embraced then the PCD2 as a possibility?
Through the PUD ordinance that was adopted for the site.
Yeah. There was a process involved in that.
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
Because I think Member Risser was concerned that this all got done on a consent agenda basis.
The second reading of the ordinance was done on consent.
Commissioner.
So was there ever, when residents got letters in the mail talking about this PUD being created, were they informed that all PCD2 uses would be allowed? Was that part of the communication with the residents?
Not specifically.
Okay,
no.
Because I am getting a lot of concerns from people about transparency. What happened to the transition zone? Why was that not taken into account? You know, how can this be happening? Can we go back so that we have only office use that is allowed in that area? And it may be that it's procedurally correct, but it just feels, and I'm getting a lot of people talking to me and really being concerned that there isn't that transparency. They have no idea how this happened. And they had no idea that it was actually under the governance of PCD2. And so I want to put that out there. I think we need to figure out a way to move forward with development so that it's clearer and more consistent. And again, you know, this is very, very disconcerting. And I am absolutely concerned about our PCD1 zones, that, you know, to open that up to all residential. And I know I'm kind of going back and forth, but we can't be doing this. This is going to have a really, really negative effect on Edina, I think. You know, because people, when they come here and they buy homes, they trust that there is a basis for the neighborhood in which they are investing. And this seems very problematic. But thank you.
Thank you, Director Teague. All right, I know we're close at hand here. I'll get to my questions and comments here. So, Manager Neuendorf, are you on the line?
I am, yes.
So, okay, good, thanks. So I just jotted a few, excuse me, a few things down as you were talking, and others are making comments. So first of all, the use of TIF fills a gap in financing. We talked about that in one of your initial slides. But without a public purpose for that gap, if potentially filling that gap, we would not consider assisting in this development or any other development. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's Edina's TIF policy. There has to be public benefit.
All right. Public purpose per our policy. Is that correct?
I can add to that too, Mr. Chair. I would say that under state law, there are much broader uses that are allowed for tax increment. By policy, you have narrowed them. And the way that you've really narrowed them is that there has to be this public purpose, you know, and there's can be lots of discussion about a range of public purpose. But technically in a redevelopment district, you could use tax increment to help a developer pay for private bricks and mortar. You know, it isn't typically done, but we are in a very narrow use and tie it to this idea of public
I've lost
purpose.
the video and audio feed.
We all have, Bill.
Yeah, thanks for getting up, Mr. Lindgren. I think that's a great point, that in some communities, they have actually provided developer subsidies to get some redevelopment going or some development going in those communities. That's not our policy or practice.
Right, right. We try to tie the tax increment.
And something you've covered before, and I think you could well handle this question, the way this is structured in 2 phases, and we haven't approved anything yet for phase 2, but 80%, as I recall it, of the TIF benefit occurs in phase 1. Is that roughly accurate from a percentage standpoint?
I might state it slightly differently, Mr. Chair. I mean, and we've lost the video, but if you remember the slide of the public access areas, right, that's over 50% of the site.
Of the site, right.
Right. All of that is required under the redevelopment agreement to be built with the office building as a part of phase 1. So phase 1 is the project here that's tax increment funded, right? And so all the stuff that goes around what might be the hotel, that has to be built. The phase 2 TIF note doesn't support the hotel or anything else. The phase 2 TIF note says, well, there'll be additional increment created that we need to utilize to get to that total 7 amount. So if you built that second building on phase 2, then there's more increment. So it's in some ways, I think, a very good deal for the city that all those things that we call public benefit that are embodied in those public places, they have to be built as a part of phase 1 and reimbursed out of that first TIF note, you know, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, the 5.8 million or whatever it is.
Yeah, the TIF benefits basically almost in whole attached to phase 1 that's been approved.
All right. In some ways, phase 2 for this purpose is just a revenue generator that helps reimburse the gap that's created because we've said as a part of phase 1, give us all this public infrastructure. You know, so that is somewhat unique in the way that we do these, because it's sort of they have to build it even if they only get TIF note phase 1. I mean, so that's another way that we've kind of shifted the risk, you know, entirely on the developer.
Right. Thank you. With regard to that, I like that underpass definition for the concept of going underground to connect east of France with west of France. In the past, this is just an observation, we had another bridge concept that came in one redevelopment proposal, but that proposal never worked out either. This is kind of the place where it's a lower spot on France Avenue. It makes some sense either to go over or under across from what we could call the Macy's Home Store. So I'm glad you're thinking this way. And I think I'm hearing from the HRA that they like this idea generally. Member Risser didn't comment on it, but I'm assuming that.
I think we could use spark funds for that.
Yeah, but the concept of having some sort of connector, you like that idea?
I do like that idea, and I think we could use spark funds for that. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, okay. All right, source of funds aside, I think you've got unanimity of opinion here, Manager Neuendorf, that we like the idea of looking at that. I don't know if you had any other comment. No. All right. The other thing I just wanted to quickly comment on with regard to public benefit, you know, from the time we started looking at these properties and that old Oscar Roberts gravel pit and the fact that this property, and let's make it clear that this property that's owned by these developers is the one that's gathering water from about 10 other properties. I've always thought that the city should have a role here in being responsible for dealing with this water that accrues on one particular piece of property from other properties that they don't own. So I like the idea that we're including this stormwater management feature. It's really critically important, I think. The idea that no other building in Edina has a LEED certification, so at the silver level, I think that's an interesting notion. And then we've got the developer making a direct benefit. This might be for Mr. Lindgren. We get the developer making a direct benefit to the public of about $2 million, because I understand the public improvements are about 9.5, and we're committing 7.5 from a public investment standpoint. Is that, am I stating that properly or understanding that correctly? Not only are we getting 51% of the use of the property through easements, but the developer is also contributing to that public benefit in other ways.
Yeah, I think that's true. In other words, we've identified in excess of $9 million worth of things that, in your staff and consultants' opinion, meet your definition of public benefit, but we're only reimbursing for approximately $7 million of that, right?
So let's say 1.9 is coming from
a couple $1 million of additional public benefit.
Plus giving us 51% use of the property by way of easement.
Correct.
All right. And I like that clawback provision too, that back-end TIF analysis, that TIF need analysis, to see if we were correct in our assumptions at the beginning. So those are just my comments. And next, Manager Neuendorf, next step is coming to the council. We lose him again. You may know this, Mr.
Otherwise,
Lindgren.
yes, I believe that the actual redevelopment agreement is proposed to be.
I can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear us?
I think it's working
Our next
both
step,
ways.
we'll be back next week at the city council meeting on the 18th with the full document. We'll be looking for your support at that time.
We're looking forward to having you here live. All right, thank you. Well, I guess, yeah, you could have some prohibiting factors there, like COVID, for example. All right, thank you. That's all I had. Anybody else, that cause anybody else to think about anything? Anybody have any comments? We'll move on to the next portion of the agenda. Executive Director comments, anything? Okay. So I got the suit and tie on today because it's Meet with the Governor Day for MLC. So we'll go over there this afternoon, just let everybody know that we've got certain issues that we want to cover with the governor, including housing-related issues, transportation, infrastructure, public safety, adult use marijuana, paid family medical leave. Those are kind of the key top issues that we'll cover with him.
How about sales tax? No block from sales tax.
I think that we'll probably stay to the higher level interests of the MLC, and we won't have time because we'll only have a half hour with them to talk about our individual city requests. but maybe we can have a little sidebar with them.
Yeah, my question goes to the decision on the House to not have any local option sales taxes for anybody.
Oh.
And so,
Okay.
Consider that if you have time. I think
All
that's
right.
something I'd like to hear
I'll add
feedback
that to the
on.
list.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
All right, very good. I think that does it for us. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I second.
Get a motion by Commissioner Risser, a second by Commissioner Agnew to adjourn the meeting of the HRA this 13th day of April 2023. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adjourning say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. We stand adjourned.